Well, welcome back, leaders. We're glad you're here. Welcome to lesson 2 of our 1 Corinthians packet.
Hope you guys got off to a great start last week, and here we go.
Yeah, here we go. So just want to give you a quick reminder that we do have a group discussion guide, and this week it's on page 32. And one of our best tips for leading is to actually, once you've got a few lessons under your belt, and even from the beginning, is to have time to look back. So your group had made some applications. They had maybe started their Every Neighbor map. So take a few minutes during your connect time, check in with how people are doing, but then refer back to last week's lesson and just ask, hey, how did you do with application? Did God bring anything up? Were there any encounters with people that you've been praying for? It's a really great way to keep kind of the lessons going and connected in people's minds.
Carolyn, in this lesson, we're going to cover a lot of ground, from analogies to future eschatological rewards to all kinds of Every Neighbor map stuff and whatnot. But if you were to kind of identify some big wins that for our leaders as they jump into this lesson, kind of big goals, if they could hit these amidst all the other things, what would those be as you kind of think about it?
Well, one of them that I think is that, people in Corinth and then people today, we can lose track of our vision of who we are, our identity, and then who we belong to. And we can get pulled in a lot of different directions that way. And so for me, one of the big wins from this discussion that you'll have today is to get some clarity and some reminders for people of their basic identity and belonging.
I think one other thought I'd give you guys as we're kind of early on in 1 Corinthians and early on in a semester is we're going to get to some, I think, pretty interesting and fun and complex interpretive questions. But really this early on in the study, really teaching your people how to observe the text is really the priority. So you're going to see us in this kind of opening section talk a little bit about how to ask interpretive questions, which is really an observational skill. And observation really is the foundation upon which we're going to build kind of people's Bible study skills. And so don't rush off to interpretation. We're going to talk even more about that tonight in this video, but really help kind of lay that foundation well, help people begin to really learn to train their eyes to see the text well.
Yeah, for sure. So as we look at this section, this is the first lesson in which we've had people read a longer section of Scripture. And then in the observation, we've had them focus in on a key part of that. So Trey, how would you tackle this?
Yeah, I think, even you talked about referring back to last week's lesson. I think as we jump into this section, we're always trying to think through how does it connect with what's come before it. And really chapters 1 all the way to kind of chapter 4 or 5 is really kind of a unit. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of picked it up at 118 last week. And really this section, I kind of like the way one of the commentators put it, that the previous couple chapters, chapters 1 and 2, were Paul kind of correcting their view of the message of God. And then here in chapters 3 and 4, he's going to correct their view of the ministry of God, or the minister and the role of the minister themselves. That with those two things being corrected, he can address some of the fractions and some of the divisions and some of the disorder that exists here. And so really as you jump into observation, it kind of gives you a little flow of kind of where we've been and kind of what we're going to expect this week. We're going to kind of highlight the skill of interpretive questions. And so really what these interpretive questions are just your basic who, what, where, why, how. And what we're trying to get people to do is just begin to kind of jog their mind as to the different things they are trying to see in the text. And so we're not really yet to interpretation and kind of answering questions, but we're simply trying to ask questions that we can kind of trigger people to see and see more deeply. One of the kind of games or challenges I remember even as an early seminary student, my first class with a professor, as we were learning to study the Bible, was he gave us a section of 5 verses and he said, I wanted you to come up with 10 observations. And so we did 10 observations. It was easy. And then he said, I now wanted you to come up with another 10 observations. And that was a little bit harder. And then he goes, I want you to come up with another 10. And so really what I would challenge your group to do is to see how deeply you can go in terms of observing verses 1 to 9. How many different things can people see? How many different questions can they generate that can help them see even more deeply? Really helping kind of, again, lay that foundation of learning to see the text without having to answer all the questions just yet about it.
Yeah, so good. And by doing that, then you can actually then become to see some of the themes that emerge. If you see repeated words, if you see Paul even asking rhetorical questions, naming people, asking who is that person. So you begin to identify some of the themes. But what's interesting too in this section is that Paul uses a lot of analogies and metaphors, I would say, figurative language. That is also interesting. So Paul is the great teacher. He's trying to get people's imaginations rewired from the worldly wisdom to the wisdom of God. And he's using great things here.
Yeah, and so if you're kind of going through a few things you're going to see, he's going to talk about infants and milk and solid food in their diet. And he's going to talk about kind of the analogy of ministry as someone who's planting, someone who's watering, someone, and then God who causes the growth. You're going to see him refer to the church and the church as being development as either a field in which we're tending a field as ministers, or to a building, and we're building a building, of course, the foundation that's going to be Jesus himself. And then lastly, you're going to see kind of an analogy about fire that's testing the quality of how we've invested our life and the work that we've done in terms of investing in the church. And so you're going to see a lot of different analogies in this section that I think it makes it kind of vivid and have a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, for sure. And something most people could relate to. If you can't relate to one, you probably can relate to another one of these. So yeah, Paul the master teacher for sure.
Well, let's jump into interpretation and really kind of question one. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah. So again, part of what we want to do is keep the flow of the whole book in people's minds. And so this is what question one is all about. We're asking people to look back at the first big chunk. And as if you remember what Paul in verse 11 of chapter 1, he identifies why, the occasion for this section. So he has heard reports from Chloe's people about divisions and quarrels amongst them. So I think it's just a great question here to say, looking back at all of these chapters, what are some of those big pieces of disunity? And it's kind of like a softball question that you could throw out to your group just to get them talking, get them looking back through. But some of the things, of course, that I identified for disunity were tribalism, partisanship, identifying with one leader over another, quarreling and fighting, of course, using worldly values to make decisions, using worldly wisdom, and then in this section, being immature, basically, and boasting in people. I think some of those are the causes of disunity. And then things that promote unity. I would say, to me, it's this realignment to the message of the cross. That's what Paul is going to hammer on throughout this whole book. But in this section, the message of the cross is self-giving love. So if the disunity and the immaturity is causing people to strive and to look for hierarchy and who's the best and judging one another, self-giving love will produce unity. All of those things produce disunity. And then the other big thing I saw was that remembering whose party this is. I mean, this is God's church. And if we make any stake of claim that this is my group, this is my church,
my people.
Yeah, my people. So a reminder of whose church this is, God's.
In question one, we kind of are kind of putting the lens of unity and disunity over this section. In question two, we're kind of transitioning from the lens of unity and disunity to the question or the lens of maturity and immaturity, which really, they're two sides of the same coin. Because where we're going to see unity, we're going to see maturity, and we're going to see order. Where we're going to see disunity, we're going to see immaturity, and we're going to see disorder. And those themes are going to weave throughout the entirety of this book as we go section by section. Yeah. So in question two, how does this section kind of further develop Paul's exhortations towards spiritual maturity? I kind of broke it down this way. I think verses 1 to 4 kind of reveal the problem that exists of immaturity within the Corinthian church. And what Paul's going to say is where we see this kind of faction-based affiliation where we see these divisions and kind of allegiances to different leaders and teachers is there because of an underlying root issue of immaturity within the Corinthian church. They've bought into the wisdom of the world. They've bought into what is not actually making them wise and what's not actually making them mature. So verses 1 to 4, I think, kind of reveal the problem of immaturity. I think verses 5 to 15 then kind of highlight the solution to that problem. And what he's going to do in the solution in verses 5 to 15, I think he's going to reframe again for them how the ministry of God works and how the role of the minister works. And so he's going to reframe for them the fact that teachers are basically fellow workers all under God. They're actually not just fellow workers, but they're equal workers with different roles, different timings, but they're all equal to one another. There's not a ranking of the teachers of God, although we have a human tendency to do that, especially with our preferences. And so they're fellow workers, they're equal workers, they're all under God, they're all in submission to God. And ultimately, they're all working on this and building upon the same foundation that was laid, which is Jesus himself. And so no one has inherited a different foundation, and no one is building upon something different. And so they're all building upon the same foundation. They're all equal with one another. And ultimately, it's God who is causing the growth, and it's God for whom they ought to be motivated to please, not pleasing those that they're serving.
Yeah, so good. And that really answers question 3 as well. We were trying to kind of tease out a little bit how Paul is actually saying he views himself and his fellow workers in God's field. He has no problem trying to rank himself, and he doesn't try to do that with other people. He co-laborers. It's such a beautiful picture. And why is it significant is because having a right view of self and having a right view of others leads to unity, order, and thriving in the church. So it's not just I need to have a right view of myself. This is critical as we work together, as we're one body. And of course, the rest of the book will flesh this out as well.
So question 4, we ask, on what basis does God evaluate and reward his servants? I was walking through 1 Corinthians even with my 6th grade boy this week, and I said, hey, buddy, do you think God judges believers? He goes, no. Then he goes, yes. Then he goes, no. And so you could just tell even in him there was this tension. And so what we want to try to do is kind of resolve that tension and kind of flesh out exactly how does God evaluate and handle his people? And so what we're going to do here in verses 10 to 15 is a verse and a section that I remember having taught multiple times, but there's some things I saw even this time around that I'd never seen before. Particularly in verse 10, it says, according to the grace of God, which is given to me, Paul says, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds. I thought it was really interesting, as much as we've talked about the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the world, that he comes back even in this analogy about building, and he's going to talk about how he's a wise builder.
That's good.
And that he's going to be careful and not foolish with how he builds. So it's interesting that as he begins to kind of reframe the review of ministry and even of the minister, he's going to take this thread of wisdom and he's going to weave it in terms of how he invests, even of himself, in terms of the church of God and seeing it established and built up. And so one, I thought it's interesting to see this thread of wisdom, but then a couple kind of questions that kind of walk us through. Really, as he kind of walks through this section, I think the first thing I'd say is in a sense, how does he start out his description of this? And I think, how does he start off, in a sense, building? And I think what you're going to see here is he's going to talk about the foundation that is laid that every minister inherits, which is Jesus Christ himself. Then no one lays a different foundation. And if we are laying a different foundation, then we're not building the church, but we're building something entirely different.
Right.
And even if you think about a passage like Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, when the apostles and prophets are mentioned as part of the foundation, well, they're only a part of the foundation because they were the ones that first laid out the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so even in their unique role, it's all about pointing towards Jesus himself, who is the foundation. But then the question becomes, how are we judged exactly? What does it mean that God would evaluate his people? And really, you're going to get a really interesting section here, as you're going to see, in a sense, that Paul can talk about ministers building and investing in the church of God based off of 2 materials. And really, as you look at those materials, really the issue and the reality becomes that God judges his people on the basis of works. I want to kind of show you 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, because if we get reference to something we refer to as the judgment seat of Christ, that's really, really significant, not just in the Corinthian context, but even in the section. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, Paul says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, a day that's going to come in the future, so that each one of us may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he's done, whether good or bad. What Paul's saying in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, and what he's highlighting here in 1 Corinthians 3, is that a day will come for every single one of us who knows Jesus Christ, in which will appear before him at what Paul refers to as the judgment seat of Christ, or the bema. And at that moment in the future, God's going to evaluate our lives, how we lived, how we've invested them, how we've utilized our own gifts for the establishment and the development of the church. And based off of what we've invested, we will be judged and evaluated. And so in 1 Corinthians 3, Paul is highlighting there's two possibilities for the believer. One, they could have invested their lives in the establishment of a church, utilizing materials that when fire comes, it burns it all away, that there's nothing left to show, there's nothing that lasts for all of eternity. Or we could have invested our lives and our investment in the church with materials that stand the test of time, and they stand that day of evaluation or that fire, gold, precious metals that endure through that fire. And so Paul is trying to highlight for the believers in that day that they were going to be evaluated with how they invested their lives, either with things and into things that would have been consumed by fire, not lasting, or with materials that would have endured that fire. And then we get into two different possibilities. That either there is nothing that endures through that fire, and what Paul will say here in 1 Corinthians 3 is that they will suffer loss, but he makes really clear and really carefully clear, but they will be yet so as saved as though as through fire. So even if they suffer loss, even if their lives as believers, they invested with materials that didn't endure, they're still going to be saved. The other possibility is that they will receive reward if they've invested well. And so you kind of get this possibility for believers that either they will suffer loss but be saved, or they will have invested through difficulty with materials that last for all of eternity, and they'll receive reward. In fact, we kind of see this tension throughout multiple passages. And so one of the things as we kind of look at some of these other cross references, which is one of the skills that we have in the interpretive section this week, and it's a great week for it, especially with this question, because you see this idea of the evaluation of believers throughout the New Testament especially. And so we give you a series of cross references or other Bible passages that you can refer to that help speak to these ideas. And so whenever we encounter something complex or a little bit more challenging or difficult, it's really helpful to use other places in the scriptures that speak to similar ideas so that you can parse through and kind of help better explain what you're running up into and what the Bible is trying to tell us, because it's going to be consistent with what it's saying throughout itself. And so we use other verses to help explain those things. That's why we call them cross references. We're going to refer to other places. And as we refer to some of these other places, you're going to see kind of, I think, a little bit of a tension that exists in the evaluation that God has for believers. In some ways, as he evaluates us, you're going to see it. There's an unconditional element of that evaluation. And in some ways, you're going to see that there's a conditional element to that evaluation. There's something that's at stake conditionally based off of how we live. And there's something that's not at stake for the believer based off of how we live. So in 2 Corinthians 3, you're going to see that even for the guy who suffers loss, he's still going to be saved, yet as though through fire. So even for the believer who's not invested their lives well, they're still going to have eternity. Their relationship with God is secure. We get that same idea in other places as well. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul will say that God still remains faithful even if we are not faithful. That even in our disobedience, that God is faithful to us, that he preserves us for all eternity. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul will speak repeatedly about his confidence that what God has begun in the church, that he will finish one day. So even if we don't always live our lives perfectly well, even if we don't invest our lives in ways that will stand the evaluation for all of eternity, one of the things that Paul is doing in some of these verses is reminding us that God is faithful to us, even if our performance is not great. But the other thing that he does in some of these passages is he's going to highlight that there is something that's available for us if we endure, if we live our lives for eternity. And so really, as you kind of walk through a lot of these passages and a lot of these cross-references, you're going to see the idea of crowns throughout a lot of these. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, Paul will talk about the crown of righteousness that he receives for having finished the race well. In James chapter 1 and Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3, we see reference to the crown of life that is given to the believer who endures persecution and trials. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4, Peter talks about the crown of glory that is given to elders who shepherd the flock well. And so you see throughout the scriptures, there's this repetition, there's this constant thread that's woven through that even if we are not faithful, God is faithful to us, that our relationship with him is preserved. But as we endure and as we invest our lives for eternity in the things that matter, there's reward for us, sometimes mentioned as crowns, and in other places, Revelation chapter 2, verse 25 to 27, 2 Timothy 2:12, and then also Revelation chapter 5, verse 10. The other idea that we see is that when Christ returns to one day reign in a millennial kingdom, that the faithful men and women who have endured persecution, who have been faithful to him, will have the opportunity to come back and will reign alongside of him in an age that is to come. So there's a lot of reference to rewards. There's a lot of reference to crowns. There's a lot of reference to the opportunity to reign with him. As to always what all of those rewards are, what exactly every crown is. Sometimes in Revelation, the writer will talk about hidden manna from heaven. I don't know what that is, but there's all of these ideas, and there's this thread of reward throughout the scriptures referring to and motivating the believer to live a life that's righteous. And so you kind of get, again, this idea of an unconditional element and then a conditional element as well. Yeah. What else would you add to this?
Good. I don't know if there's anything to add, Trey. You covered that really well. I think for me, just the concept that God is inviting us into this partnership with him. And it's a real partnership. There are consequences for what we do or what we don't do. It's not just, when we think of the word spiritual, we just maybe think of, it's floaty in the sky. No, it's actual. And what I loved about, this 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15, he's talking about real and lasting things, gold, silver, precious metals, giving again the imagery that this is consequential, weighty. These are the most precious things that the people in Corinth would imagine. And so that's what God is saying, that's the value behind it, of what we're talking about. So the last question here is sort of like a wrap-up question. So if the first question one was kind of like looking back, kind of a big view, here's another one that's kind of a way to summarize. And I think it's a great one to just ask, so now that we've talked about all these things, what is the relationship between spiritual maturity and unity? Can you have one without the other? And hopefully from what we've discussed, you can lead that discussion well. For me personally, as Trey said, they're two sides of a coin. They go hand in glove. To me, again, the message of the cross, self-giving love, that, the epitome of the mature person is that they would lay down their life and think themselves, that others are more important. And so what could bring people together more than that?
Question 5, I think, also helps kind of make sure you don't get stuck and go down deep into a well on eschatology and future rewards, because we want to try to make sure you recognize that discussion is in a sense supporting a bigger idea. So we're trying to get you back to that bigger idea as you put it together, and then help us get it to application as well.
Yeah, and so application, we had 2 questions. I think if I were leading this study, I would probably hone in on number 2. Do you see your life as wholly dedicated in service to God? That kind of refers back to chapter 3, verse 5, the diakonos, the minister, the servant. That's how Paul identifies himself. He's a servant. So as we think about our own lives, are we a servant to God? Is that our primary identity? Or are we looking to other causes, other things? Not that those things are wrong or bad, but are they slowly taking precedence over our primary allegiance to Christ and his kingdom? And then the Engage tool, as we said last time, is the Every Neighbor map again. But one thing we were talking about, a way to use it in the context of this chapter on unity, or this lesson on unity, maybe to bring that back out and ask your group to think through, is there any disunity in these spheres that I know of? In spheres where I live, in my neighborhood, where I work, where I learn at school, or in the places where we play? Are there any dads that are yelling at the umpires?
Never happens.
Never happens.
I never do it.
But using it as a prayer prompt, we are people of peace. That's who God has called us to be. And so to pray pray for unity in those spheres could be just an awesome thing to close your lesson in. So that's what we have today.
It's really good. I think just to remind you, taking you back all the way to our survey, that part of what we talked about with the book of Corinthians is it's the church in the city.
Yeah.
And so as we get to know our neighbors, as we pray for our neighbors, and as we think about how can we be people of peace and people that bring unity in these spheres where there's often fracture and there's often division and there's often distrust, how do we as the people of God moving into those spaces outside of the walls of the church have that kind of influence, that kind of aroma, because that looks very otherness and it's also very inviting. So we are praying for you guys, excited for this week's lesson, excited for the chance you guys are going to have to jump into the text and see how the Lord moves through it. We love you guys, praying for y'all.